Welcome back to the Majority Report. I am Michael Brooks, and joining us now is Maria Hanun. She is a PhD student at Georgetown University. And Sophie Spahn, she is a PhD candidate at Utrecht University in the Netherlands. They are both studying Islamic and Arabic studies at their respective institutions, and they are the co-authors of a recent piece in Foreign Policy magazine, When Europe Loved Islam. Thank you both for joining us.
Thanks for having us on the show.
Yeah, exactly.
Sophie, I want to start with you, but I'm going to go to both of you on this before we get to your article. There is a very powerful public discourse now on Islam, and it comes through a number of filters. Often on this show, we talk about Islam and Middle East issues, I would say, through primarily a policy lens that is informed by history, culture, geography, anthropology, and economics. There's also a predominant discourse, which is very trendy right now and very popular in sort of the world of Reddit and online, that kind of reduces Islam and religion generally to some sort of like scientific proposition that is correct or not. And of course, scientifically it's not correct. So therefore, Islam or Christianity or whatever is quote unquote wrong. I want to know from the perspective of somebody who actually studies this academically and historically, what is the mechanism through which you study Islam as an academic and an actual expert in the field? Sophie, I'm starting with you, but Maria, I want you to jump in right after.
Well, I think that if you study any sort of topic academically or more in depth, you'll find that everything is more complicated than it seems, and that there are different facets to a story, and that you can also not, there are many different types of Islam, there are many different types of religion. It's really hard to generalize too much. Besides that, I mean, I was trained originally as a historian, and I'm researching a very historical project, so I'm approaching it in that way as well. So in a specific context, specific time, specific actors. That would be, I think, my perspective on that.
Yeah, and just to echo what Sophie's saying, I mean, I think that the study of Islamic studies could mean so many things. So for some people, for some of my colleagues, that means studying Islamic law and the centuries of legal tradition that have developed around Islam. For some people, it's looking at practice, how those laws have been applied in practice. For some people, it is looking at the Quran and how the Quran is constructed and trying to understand the language. And for us, we're both more historians. We study intellectual history. And so we look at people who think about how Islam, is enacted in society through different kinds of political movements, through writing, through literature, and in society with the construction of Islamic institutions. And so to deny that Islam should be kind of engaged with is to deny, centuries of history and a whole, many facets of society.
So you're saying that to complete any, not just a PhD, but any type of academic course of study in these subject matters, you couldn't say, as an example, my thesis is Islam is bad ideas, supporting evidence, Richard Dawkins tweet, and other guy who doesn't have training in Islam with some selected quotes. That wouldn't work?
I probably wouldn't pass my dissertation.
Yeah, I don't think you would make it to the doctorate that way.
Whoa. All right. Well, I guess we're all just regressive apologists, but I just wanted to kind of get that out of the way before we jump into this. So this is fascinating, and Maria, I'll start with you this time.
Great.
This piece is When Europe Loved Islam, and there's two different tracks to this conversation. There's a political track and a cultural track. We're going to start culturally.
Great.
In the 1920s, you paint a picture of in Berlin and other important, intellectually rigorous and open European capitals and major cities of interest in Islam as something that is totally outside of discourse today, something more analogous to like the way some people might look at Buddhism, actually, as a religion that is more compatible with the modern world, that is more adaptive and responsive to present and modern conditions, and in reaction to a sort of exhaustion with Christianity and modernist projects at Europe at the time. How did Islam start to play that role in Europe in the 1920s, and then specifically, or actually just start with that, and then I'll go to Sophie. Go ahead.
So yeah, one of the major trends we look at are the kind of movement of people and ideas through empire. And so in this period after World War One, there was a large influx of Muslims into some of these European capitals. There were many scholars, Muslim scholars, immigrants, travelers. And among these were the Ahmadiyya missionaries. So
Mm-hmm.
these are missionaries from the Punjab region of British India. And they constructed mosques and they were very effective missionaries. And so one of the places we look at and is sort of central to our article is the Wilmersdorf Mosque in Berlin. And you see it happening there where there's this frustration with European sort of Christian society in the wake of World War One. There's a lot of confusion, a lot of disillusionment with modernity and with the past. And so through the Ahmadiyya missions, kind of you can see them tapping into this with their lectures on Islam and modernism and the future of humanity. And so I think that it was just a kind of active and very interesting intellectual climate at this time.
So, Sophie, to be clear, though, that this mission, and I want you to get more into the specifics of it, and also this idea that was popular at the time across the spectrum of political thought in Europe of this notion of the new man. Fascists talked about it, socialists talked about it, but that the this group from the Punjab was not saying, they weren't coming to Germany and saying the modern world is fallen and corrupted and we need to recreate some fantasized version of the 7th century. They were saying that Islam has a particular insight on how to modernize, which actually, in some ways, in that context, was more egalitarian. There was a strong anti-racist bent. We won't get into this, but also the this mission also was in the United States at this time and gained popularity with African Americans because of an anti-racist message. Get into the specifics of what they were saying and how it fit into a specific response to modernity.
Well, first of all, it was a context where in Berlin at that time, um, there was a space for a lot of sort of people who activists, students who wanted to act against Muslim students, activists wanted to act against British and French imperialism.
Mm-hmm.
So in that sense, there was sort of a bohemian, yeah, site for them to come together. And the Ahmadiyya were not the only Muslim actors in Berlin at this time. There were different groups, but they were a very important one, and they were a group with a mosque.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and their sort of vision of modernity was also linked to the First World War and the devastating effect that had had on Europe and specifically on Germany. So there were many people who felt disillusioned, who felt just disappointed and almost as if Christianity had failed and the war had been a result. So there was a space for these kind of new ideas, and there was a lot of interest in different types of spiritualism, not just Islam, but many, different outlets for these sort of feelings. And the Ahmadiyya were very much trying to promote a very rational, modern, progressive Islam, and that's what they wrote about. And they did this, of course, also to gain converts, but they felt that this was something that would resonate with all these European intellectuals, which it did. But they had a sort of a really an intellectual conversation there in the Wilmersdorf Mosque with people from all different backgrounds. So that's what they tapped into. And their magazines, in the one in Berlin and also in Woking, and they published also from British India, this they had a very wide reach, and these magazines were read in many different places all over Europe and also in the Muslim world. They were also kind of a controversial movement in a way, but at this time, these sort of identities were quite fluid, and they did have a conversation in the 20s with a lot of different people.
Maria, I want you to talk specifically to this concept of the new man and how these Islamic movements responded to it and put their own specific spin on it.
Yeah, so one thing we talk about in our piece is just how the new man was this sort of philosophical concept that was quite trendy at this time, and it really focused on the individual. And we see it in even Nietzsche's Ubermann as this
Hmm.
person who would be kind of excel in society or a leader. And then in the case of Hugo Marcus, who was one of the important converts in Berlin at this time, and he was actually a gay Jewish philosopher, and he was engaging with all of these people, Spinoza and Kant and Nietzsche and Goethe. And for him, the new man, this sort of utopian ideal of the human being, what was found in Islam. And so he kind of looked at the trajectory of monotheism through Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and saw in Islam the sort of logical conclusion or progression of these monotheisms. And therefore, Islam became the kind of spiritual foundation for the society in which this new man would be, or this sort of ideal man of the future would be constructed. And in his other writings, he really focuses on the kind of progressive and intellectual message of Islam. So, another piece that I read by him, he talks about the hadith or sayings of the Prophet, and he uses the fact that these sayings were recorded and passed down through generations to show that in the East, sort of interiority and the individual were so important for such a long time. And this is a relatively new concept in Europe. So he kind of
Hmm.
is really focusing on the philosophical, individualist, and very sort of modern message of Islam.
So, Sophie, I can already hear the kind of heads exploding over that sort of comment that there was this sense of interiority in Islam and in the East. Now, I think obviously there are distinctions, and we have to sort of draw differentiations, and there are different models of government and different ways people were individuated in politics and religion for that matter. But we have no discourse and understanding of that for most people. When you hear the idea that there was individuality in Islam, people would either have no reference point for it, or they would say that you're making some type of kind of like postmodern working backwards apology and making up something, projecting backwards into something that wasn't there to begin with. So, can you give us more specifics in terms of what that individuality looked like and how it was retrieved and used in these conversations in the 20s in Europe?
Well, see, in this specific context, there were, they were very much trying to be part of Europe,
Hmm.
and they were trying to approach Europe in a way. Look, there were many different sort of Islam reformist movements at
Absolutely.
this time, and
Hmm.
also in the 19th century. So this was not like a completely new idea, but people were conceptualizing new ideas and looking in the Quran and looking in different places to find like ideas of how Islam would be completely aligned with new technologies and all these kind of things. That was already before. And the Ahmadiyya really were trying to show people in Europe, like, you can be European and you can be Muslim. And there's no, the one doesn't exclude the other. So, and someone like Hugo Marcus is also interesting because he looks at Islam not necessarily through a genealogy of Islamic philosophers, but and Islamic scholars, but he looks very much at Islam through this idea of all these European philosophers,
Hmm.
which is, kind of turning that whole idea around as well and going further into showing that European side in a way rather than only looking towards the East. But then other people did other things. So there's a huge variation as well in the way that people were approaching these intellectual conversations. But there was this idea that we're looking towards the future and we're taking some texts and we're taking ideas and we're trying to create the best future in Europe. And that would have included Islam in that way.
Yeah, and I do think that, the individual and the individual's relationship with society was such an important question in the post-war World War One and sort of interwar period. And so, and I mean, we even see it earlier in the history of kind of European philosophy. And so, tapping into that, I think the Ahmadiyya mission really was tapping into those questions as well, and kind of looking at how Islam could help facilitate or explain how the individual functions in society and is part of this modern society.